Once every century or so, our planet stops. A global crisis changes everything. What will a post-COVID-19 world look like? Immense disruption can spur reinvention in healthcare, social welfare, work, education, and business. Faced with catastrophe, societies can crumble or gain strength. Countries can go to war or find new ways to work together. Governments can use new technologies as a tool for creation or destruction. The Bloomberg New Economy connects leaders of East and West to discuss a better world. Our neutral platform facilitates purposeful, data-driven conversations on pathways to common prosperity. Inequality costs lives. Poverty incubates disease. Climate change creates hunger and refugees. When this pandemic is over, we must build a new economy that works for everybody.
Good morning and welcome once again to Bloomberg New Economy Conversations, the series where we explore how businesses and governments around the world are responding to the coronavirus pandemic. Today's conversation is focused on the race to find a COVID-19 vaccine. We've got terrific speakers joining us today, and we're going to get right into the conversation, looking at the amazing speed at which vaccine candidates are being tested on humans, the global effort to ramp up vaccine manufacturing, and the challenge of ensuring equitable distribution, a key issue for us here at the Bloomberg New Economy. As always, I'm joining you from rural New Hampshire, which is a long way from our splendid Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. And I'd like to welcome our global community of Bloomberg New Economy delegates who joined us at the forum in Beijing and Singapore these past 2 years. We also welcome the thousands of listeners tuning in on social media and via the Bloomberg terminal. There will be opportunities throughout this conversation for real-time input from you, our audience. I encourage you to submit questions in the text box, which you'll find in the bottom right of your screen, and I'll invite you to vote in live polling in the top right of your screen. If at any point you encounter technical difficulties, a simple refresh of your browser should help things get back on track. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guests. Mike Froman is the Vice Chairman and President of Strategic Growth at Mastercard. He previously served as the U.S. Trade Representative from 2013 to 2017. Mike, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
Dr. Anita Zaidi. Dr. Anita Zaidi is the Director of the Vaccine Development, Surveillance, and Enteric and Diarrheal Diseases Program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Good morning to you, Dr. Zaidi.
Morning, Andy.
So we're in a global war against COVID-19. The White House has put a 4-star general in charge of Operation Warp Speed to find a vaccine this year, along with a former pharma executive. Global businesses and philanthropies are joining the campaign. Before we get into our conversation, we'd like to hear how optimistic our audience is about a vaccine. And judging from the questions that have been flooding into our system all morning, this is the question that is uppermost in pretty much everybody's mind. What is the most likely timeline for development of a COVID-19 vaccine? Option number one, end of 2020. Option number two, end of 2021 is just coming up on your screen now. By the end of 2025, not unreasonable given that the record for producing a vaccine up until now was 4 years. I believe it was the mumps vaccine in the 1960s. Final option, never. Okay, Dr. Zaidi, while our audience is mulling their response to that question, What would be your answer? We had good news yesterday out of Moderna, a vaccine candidate. It seems to be safe. It's triggered an immune response in a small number of volunteers. How excited are you by this?
To put some nuance to your question, and then I'll get into the Moderna part of it. So development is different from scale here. And we're talking about unprecedented scale with needing 7 to 14 billion doses to immunize the whole world. So I'm actually quite optimistic that we can develop a vaccine by the end of 2020. I'm not very optimistic, or I'm not very hopeful that we can deploy a vaccine for mass use by the end of 2020 because of the unprecedented scale that we need over here to immunize the whole world. In terms of technical feasibility of vaccines, I'm actually of a COVID vaccine or a coronavirus vaccine, I'm actually very hopeful. So that's the good news. And the Moderna results are early indication of that it's not going to be technically very hard to get a vaccine that protects people. This is not going to be like an HIV type situation. I think we will get there. So the technical issues are not insurmountable. The scale and the speed at which we need scale and the financial barriers are where we need to find a solution.
So the history of vaccine development is the history of spectacular victories, but also stubborn failures. I mean, we don't have a vaccine for HIV or even the common cold. What is different about COVID-19 that makes you so optimistic?
So it seems to be a fairly stable virus that does not mutate at very high rates. So the mutation rates are slower than what we have in the flu or for HIV. And the part where we think we can, the immunogen part of the coronavirus seems to be fairly stable from what we know so far.
Okay.
Which means that if we target that region of the virus, that we should have success.
So let's see what the audience makes of this. The most likely timeline: end of 2020, 27%; end of next year, 62%. Almost nobody, 2%, only 2% think that we're never going to get a vaccine. So generally, we're an optimistic group here this morning. Mike, finding a vaccine for COVID-19 is not just a medical imperative; it's obviously a business imperative too. As a representative of Mastercard, one of the biggest businesses in the world, what's your view on the timeline for a vaccine, a successful vaccine?
Well, Andy, our view as a company that cares about global health and the health of the global economy, our view is that the biggest thing we could do is however long it takes to get to a vaccine deployed at scale, as Dr. Zaidi was talking about, it is very important that we try and accelerate the availability of treatments and testing for COVID-19, which will help both deal with the health impact, of course, of COVID-19, but also create more confidence about getting back to work and getting back to normal. And that's why Mastercard contributed to the Gates Foundation and Wellcome Trust to create this accelerator, a therapeutics accelerator, that now has raised over $300 million, including from the UK government and the Dell Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, to try and accelerate the testing, the development, the deployment, the manufacturing of treatments that can be produced at scale and made available on an equitable basis around the world.
So you started off with 125 million. Now you've crowded in several hundred million more. What's the target, and how are you accumulating these funds?
Well, I think in our view, that any company that cares, as we do, about the health of the global economy should be interested in trying to accelerate the discovery and the deployment of a therapy, of a treatment, actively working to try and encourage join in. The original goal was somewhere between $300 and $500 million to be focused on these issues. We're now giving grants to places to do screening of compounds that might be relevant and applicable to COVID-19, to reserve manufacturing capacity so that when a treatment is found, we can quickly manufacture it and get it out, and make sure that it's fit for purpose, that it's a therapy that's not just relevant to advanced industrialized countries with very well-developed health systems, but also developing countries and other countries where there may be a lower resource health system. You still want to make sure that the treatments and ultimately the vaccine can be applicable in those environments as well.
Okay, I'd like to bring in an audience question for Dr. Zaidi. This one is from Ian Petz, who's a director at Equiom in France. Ian asks, which is likely to arrive faster, herd immunity or a vaccine?
That's a great question. So even, our desire would be that we should use a vaccine to produce herd immunity rather than herd immunity through natural processes, because that will cause a lot of deaths. And this is what we're trying to avoid. And which is why public messaging right now is around social distancing, wearing masks, protecting yourself, while we work on treatments and vaccines. And so I would say, and I am optimistic about this, that we will have a vaccine before we go the route of herd protection through natural disease.
So part of the work of the Therapeutics Accelerator is to identify existing therapies that may be repurposed for the battle against COVID-19. How optimistic are you that there are these, if you like, off-the-shelf solutions waiting to be discovered?
Are you asking me or Mike?
That's for you, Dr.
Well, we're hopeful that it starts with a library.
Okay.
Sure, Mike, please go ahead.
We can both answer it. Mike, go ahead.
Please.
Okay, so I
defer to the doctor.
I am hopeful that we will find. I am hopeful that we will find some interesting compounds. There are some things that are looking interesting that could be repurposed. Repurposing saves time because repurposing means that that drug has been in humans before. And there are some interesting leads that are being looked at very carefully, where we are hopeful that we will make progress.
Mike?
Maybe Mike also.
No, absolutely. I think that that's exactly the strategy, which is if we can look through the library of the tens of thousands of compounds that the Gates Foundation and various pharmaceutical companies have made available to see which compounds that are already deemed to be safe for human use could be relevant to treating COVID-19, that's the quickest way of getting a treatment into the market. And so we're hopeful that will make a contribution here. And at the same time, we're investing in testing methodologies to make sure that we can get better tests out there in the market as well.
Dr. Zaidi, what's likely to come first?
Another interesting thing. So I was going to add a point to what Mike just said, if with your permission, Andy, is that another thing that's really important in drug development, even if we're looking at repurposed compounds, is how do you look at, is this drug likely to be successful in people? And developing the right animal models, the right cell culture in vitro assays, making sure that the same assays and the same methods and the same models are being used for all of the compounds. And that's a really critical part of the therapeutic accelerator, like standardizing measurement, standardizing evaluation, because otherwise we will have uninterpretable data from all over the world with people using different methods, and we don't know which one to believe. So that's a really critical part of the therapeutic accelerator. I'll hand it over back to you for your next question.
What comes first, therapeutics, or a therapeutic solution, or a vaccine?
So I would say that most likely a therapeutic solution will come first. Perhaps the plasma convalescent therapy could be combination medicines of some things that we are currently trying, um, and then a vaccine, right? Um, and let me then caveat that by saying that drugs are easier to scale up, right? The manufacturing of drugs is not as hard as the manufacturing of vaccines. So the barrier for vaccines is making the large number of doses that we need, right? And so we might have a vaccine that works, but unless we invest right now in the manufacturing part, then we don't know which vaccine will work. Right now we have 10 vaccines that are in people, so they are in clinical trials, and we will have to make 7 to 8 different types of manufacturing investments to start manufacturing them without seeing all of the clinical data that tells us that this vaccine is going to work in people. Okay, so that's the only way to compress that timeline, to have a vaccine almost as soon as you know that it works. Because if we do it sequentially, we are in the 2023, 2024 timeframe. We have to do these things in parallel. And that's what's different about COVID-19 effort is having to do this in parallel. And so just like the therapeutic accelerator, we are very hopeful that the world will come together around vaccines. The good news from the other piece of good news from this month is the ACT Accelerator, the global effort around tools for COVID-19, which includes vaccines, includes drugs, and includes diagnostics. $8 billion were pledged for that, for all three. But our estimate of what we need right now for these manufacturing facilities to be made at risk in parallel is somewhere between 10 to $15 billion. And we're very hopeful that the wealthy nations, wealthy philanthropists, and wealthy corporations are going to come together to put up that kind of effort, that kind of funding in the very near future, in the next month or two.
Let me just pick up on that last point. A question for you, Mike. Governments all over the world have fumbled the response to COVID-19. None of the major powers have emerged from this with their reputations enhanced. Given all that, what is the role of businesses to lead in leading the way out of this crisis?
Well, I think there are certain things that only governments can do, and they need to do them and show leadership in this area. But certainly, this crisis has underscored that there's also a important role for the private sector to play, whether it's in how they're managing their employees, the communities in which they operate, their suppliers, their customers, and what they can do both philanthropically, but also through their businesses. I mean, from our perspective, for example. We've been involved in financial inclusion for a long time. We decided to double down and now commit to bringing 1 billion people into the digital economy by 2025, because this crisis underscored just how important it was for people to be able to operate digitally as well as physically. People who were part of the digital economy who were able to continue to work, continue to transact that way, have been able to succeed and maintain a standard of living. And we've done the same thing with small and medium-sized businesses. We've committed to bring 50 million micro and small businesses into the digital economy, focus on 25 million women-owned, women-run businesses. We've committed $250 million of products and services and financial support to support small businesses over the next 5 years. And so every company will find their own way of doing this. For us, it's been really focused on how do we bring people into the digital economy, give them the tools they need to succeed, enhance their financial security and their resilience for crises like this. But every company has a role to play in doing this, as do philanthropies.
Okay, I'd like to put up a graphic, if we can, which shows the number of viruses that are emerging each year around the world. 80 new viruses discovered since 1980. I mean, it's pretty clear that businesses like governments have massively underestimated this problem. COVID-19 will cost the global economy trillions of dollars. How should businesses be building resilience into their plans? And how will COVID-19 change the way that Mastercard operates its business?
Well, I think it requires every business to look at how it does business, how it manages day to day, and how its business model needs to evolve to take these kinds of challenges and crises into account. For us, it has underscored just how important it is to move people towards electronic payments, to online. We're supporting a lot of small businesses who were brick and mortar only up to now, helping them get online, become e-commerce players so that they can continue to serve their customers and continue to interact and transact during crises like this. One thing we've seen in our business is the use of contactless payments has skyrocketed. It's up about 40%. These are the kind of tap and go. So you don't have to hand your card over. You don't have to touch a pin pad and put your pin in. Things that people want to be able to pay safely and securely in everything that they do, whether it's online with cyber protection, anti-fraud protection, or whether it's in person, being able to use tap and go in a way that allows them to pay without running the risk of interacting and of having contact. So I think for our business, we're going to keep on emphasizing that, emphasizing what we can do to help our small business partners to be resilient and help them succeed in the digital economy as well. As I said, also look to see what we can do to bring more people into the system. Just today, we're launching a challenge with the Rockefeller Foundation through our data.org consortium. We're announcing a challenge of $10 million for ideas from the data science community, the technology community, about how we might be able to use data science tools to make sure that as we come out of this crisis, we have a more inclusive recovery and a more resilient recovery. And again, that's something that we can, because we have great data science capabilities, something that we can bring to the table. Every company will find their own way of responding in kind.
So yesterday I caught up with Dr. Melanie Saville. Dr. Saville is one of the world's top vaccine experts. She's at the forefront of this battle against COVID-19. Let's listen to that discussion and then we'll return to our Q&A. Dr. Melanie Saville is the Director of Vaccine Research and Development for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI. She joins us from London. Welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Andy. Very happy to be here with you.
So, first question, the question on everybody's mind, the most important question in the world right now, when we might get a vaccine. What's a reasonable timeline, given the encouraging news we've just heard about Moderna?
So yes, that's a really very important question. And when you look at that question, I think you have to look at vaccine development in general. And when you look at usual situation, it usually takes 10 to 20 years to develop a vaccine right from the beginning to the end. And actually what we are all trying to do here in the COVID-19 situation is move that paradigm to getting to develop a vaccine in the time frame of 12 to 18 months. And with that, obviously, that requires us using the best modern technology that is available to make sure that we can rapidly develop vaccines and to move forward as rapidly as possible through the development process.
So we've approached this search for a COVID-19 vaccine in a completely different way, quite a revolutionary way, because of the sheer scale of the problem and the absolute imperative to come up with a quick solution. If we do get an early breakthrough, does this make you more optimistic that we could find vaccines for existing viruses that have so far eluded us? And secondly, for future viruses, I mean, what are the key takeaways from this crisis in terms of vaccine development?
Well, in terms of vaccine development, you will have already seen that we have actually, with candidates, been able to move from identification of a new virus, so the COVID-19 virus, into the clinic in as little with the Moderna vaccine, which is one of the vaccines that actually CEPI, the organization that I work for, has been funding. In as little as a little bit under than 10 weeks. So this just shows you that there is technology that can move very rapidly into clinical trials. What it actually builds on is data from other viruses in the past, and understanding of how to develop a vaccine as rapidly and with good technology. So we're learning a lot from COVID-19 in the fact that, moving forward so quickly is really in such an unprecedented form. No one has done that as quickly as that. And there are indeed other vaccines that have also been moved into clinical trials. So we are learning an awful lot as we move on. And as we continue the development of these vaccines, we will be scaling up the vaccines to very large-scale manufacturing, so that ultimately there can be hundreds of millions of doses of vaccine produced for the COVID-19 pandemic. And all of this and all of what we're learning now can be used, as you say, either for existing pathogens that lack a vaccine today, or indeed for the next pandemic. So by being able to move forward very rapidly and hopefully having scalable vaccines that can be moved to hundreds of millions of doses very rapidly, then vaccines can be much more rapidly impacting these sorts of outbreaks or pandemics.
So Chinese President Xi Jinping told the World Health Organization Assembly this morning that any vaccine China discovers, it will make it a global public good. He also said that China would donate $2 billion to the WHO. And China will also assist countries in developing and accessing vaccines. And yet, many number of pharmaceutical executives that we've heard are saying that they will give priority to their own populations or to countries that have invested in research, and that should come first. How does CEPI work to mitigate this kind of vaccine nationalism? And do President Xi's comments give you hope and encouragement?
Yes, indeed. Something that is particularly important to CEPI is ensuring that there is global access through a global fair allocation system for vaccines. And in a pandemic situation, we know that initially, the vaccine supply will be limited, and it will be particularly important that those most in need, no matter where they are globally, have access to the vaccines. Another important factor to take into account is that vaccine development is a very risky business. And we actually don't know at this point which of the candidates will be most successful. So really taking a global approach to vaccine development, and then taking the best candidates from that global development and ensuring the access is really the best way forward. So CEPI really supports the notion of global access. And in the context of vaccine developers that we are funding, within our contracts, we are very clear on the need of access to vaccines. There's obviously always a bit of tension between countries wanting to protect their own populations, as opposed to doing things for global good. But as I say, the best approach is a global approach. One country cannot control the disease on its own.
Just last week, a group of African leaders called for a people's vaccine for COVID-19, by which they mean that, once a vaccine is developed, it should be produced at scale and free of charge for the whole world. And not just that, They said that they want all the data and other vaccine IP to be placed in the public domain. I guess the question is, how do you incentivize pharmaceutical companies that are operating for profit to produce a vaccine if they can't actually profit from it, make money from it?
Well, we're in quite a special situation today in terms of a pandemic, which is really of global health concern. And we really need to have all of the key players around the table, including the vaccine developers. And in a circumstance like this, I mean, I think it's very important early in the development that we can de-risk the vaccines as they are being developed. And this is one of the things that CEPI specifically is doing, is we have been offering funding really right from the beginning of this pandemic, and ensuring that the funds are available early at that time when there is high risk, to ensure that vaccines can be developed. And we are partnering with those developers to help to de-risk those projects. Now, in a pandemic situation, it is actually critical that the vaccine is available to the population, and with a fair allocation system, so that a country's ability to pay is taken into consideration. And it's fair to say that, you know, the pharmaceutical industry is rising to the challenge there during the pandemic. And we also hope, obviously, post-pandemic period, that vaccines will remain available on a global basis, including to low and middle income countries, you know, through the more normal fair allocation systems.
Final question, what lessons have we learned from recent pandemics that will be valuable in dealing with this global war on COVID-19?
Well, each pandemic is challenging, and obviously vaccines are probably the only real exit strategy from this current pandemic. And as you see pandemics in the past, whether they're flu pandemics previously, developing good technologies that can be rapidly developed, I think is absolutely critical. And we will actually learn a lot through COVID-19, through the development of rapid response platforms, through the development of vaccines that can be rapidly scaled to what we think is needed to hundreds of millions of doses. And really developing vaccine candidates and their technology to do that as rapidly as possible will be the best way to fight future pandemics that we know will occur in the future.
Dr. Saville, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Andy.
That was Dr. Melanie Saville, the Director of Vaccine Research and Development for CEPI. Next question for you, Dr. Zaidi. What's your take on this vaccine nationalism? Is it going to stand in the way of a global rollout of a vaccine? And most importantly, where does it leave poorer countries? Are they going to be last in line?
So there is no way to get rid of this pandemic with having a nationalistic view of this, right? Because you will have to close down your borders and just live in isolation for the rest of time until the rest of the world is protected, and your economy can't grow in that type of circumstance. So the only way to get away, so the nationalistic approach to this is not a good approach. It in fact is doomed to failure. The only way that we can save the world and get back to normalcy is by immunizing the whole world. And the only way that we do that is by making enough vaccine for everyone and investing in making enough vaccine for everyone right now. Okay. If there is one point that I want to make, that would be the point that I make, that we should think globally, we have to act globally, and we have to finance globally right now.
Mike, a question for you. I don't want to get into geopolitics per se, but clearly geopolitics are having an impact on this global war on COVID-19. The World Health Organization is now the latest battleground between the United States and China. And in the meantime, global organizations seem to be missing in action, whether you're talking about the UN Security Council or the G7 or the G20. I mean, the world is not coming together as it should to be fighting COVID-19. I mean, maybe the better question to ask is this the moment where the entire global governance architecture falls apart? We had Kevin Rudd on this show a couple of weeks ago, and he said we're heading towards global anarchy. If Kevin is right, what are the implications for the global economy, for the global recovery, and for businesses?
Well, this kind of crisis, as Dr. Zaidi said, underscores just how much our well-being is tied up into the well-being of others, that there are certain problems that cannot be solved solely on a national basis. And that's exactly what these international forums and organizations are all about, whether it's the G7, the G20, or the international organizations like WHO. Traditionally, the US has played a very active leadership role in those organizations in driving a response to these kinds of global challenges. When the Ebola crisis came up, it was the US that helped organize the international effort to deal with the Ebola crisis. And there is a need for further leadership at the international level, whether it comes from the US or elsewhere, to get this done. China, as the second largest economy in the world, definitely has a role to play. It's got a lot at stake in how the global economy evolves, and it's important that it make its contribution. But that's not a substitute for leadership by the US or other major countries who have traditionally been focused on the global health imperatives and how to make sure that there is global cooperation. So private sector can do things, philanthropy can do things. Ultimately, we also need the official sector to step up, show leadership, use the existing or new forums to get things done that only can be done by governments at the global level.
Okay, let's go to our second poll question. You see in the top right of your screens. A question here: where is the first viable vaccine most likely to be developed? North America, China, Europe. Final choice: Australia and Asia, ex China. While our audience considers that question, Dr. Zaidi, we have a question here from the audience, from Mark Childs, who's a senior vice president of HSBC in the United States. He asks, how can the challenges of distributing the vaccines globally in scale be overcome?
Right. Mass distribution. Sorry, you need me to speak up?
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't hearing you. I think you've just come back. Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, so mass distribution. Now, luckily, the world has systems for mass distribution of vaccines because they have routine immunization systems. And however, for a COVID vaccine, what will have to be done is campaign delivery, right? And we have a lot of experience in developing countries in what's called campaign delivery, where you announce to the country that a vaccine is going to be delivered through a campaign, and then people line up in designated spots and get their shot. In the US, this happened in the 50s when polio vaccine was developed. And so we need to start thinking about how we would distribute on a global scale who gets vaccine first, the most vulnerable, the most in need, healthcare workers, elderly population, rest of the population.
Okay, a second question coming in. This one is from, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing this correctly, a question from Zimbabwe, Tadi Wanashe Zuda, and he is an analyst at Spear Capital. He says, distribution will be key. Do we have the global logistical capacity to ensure that every country gets these vaccines at good or reasonable prices? That's a critical issue once they're out? I don't know, either Mike or Dr. Zaidi.
So I can take that. The whole idea of CEPI, where you just heard from Dr. Savell, and of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, is to make vaccines accessible at a very reasonable price. For developing countries, these would be free. That's the idea, that they would be available to developing countries for free, paid for by the donor community and others. The distribution will be using existing mechanisms. So in Zimbabwe, there are campaign mechanisms for delivering the vaccine. Now, some of the logistic challenges are going to be around the cold chain. Is this a vaccine that needs a lot of cold storage? And some of the vaccines, for example, the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer BioNTech or CureVac, the nucleic acid vaccines, are minus 70, so it's very cold storage. And all of those things will need to be thought through to get the vaccine to the last mile. The other vaccines are not minus 70, but they will still need cold storage.
Okay, question from James Crabtree from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. He asks, the odds that a vaccine is likely to be developed either by the US or China, in either of these outcomes, what, if anything, can be done to avoid this process creating new tensions between the two superpowers? Mike, how would you respond to James Crabtree?
Well, look, there are a number of issues in the U.S.-China relationship, and some of which are more conflictual and some of which are more cooperative. And I think we're all hopeful that when it comes to this pandemic, we're going to find ways of making sure the scientific communities, the pharmaceutical communities are cooperating with each other for the best possible outcome, even as each country pursues its national interests in other areas. You've got to compartmentalize one element of the relationship from the other. But just to go back to something that Dr. Zaidi was referring to for a moment ago, I think this underscores just how important equitable access is, not just in terms of being able to get access to a vaccine or a treatment, but to make sure that that vaccine or treatment can be delivered in difficult environments. There may be some vaccines and treatments that are very much applicable to the United States and Europe, where you've got a lot of investment in healthcare systems. We got to make sure that the vaccines and treatments that are being worked on are also going to be relevant to low resource environments and can be delivered in those low resource environments effectively. And that's a big focus of the accelerator and the other work that's being done through CEPI as well.
Let's go back to the results of our poll here. Where are we most likely to see a successful vaccine coming from? 54% think North America. Only 15% think it's going to come out of China. 25% Europe. Dr. Zaidi, does that surprise you? I mean, China, along with the United States, are the two world biotech superpowers, the biggest troves of data, the biggest groups of scientists and researchers. I think they have at least a half dozen or so vaccine candidates now in human trial. Does that surprise you?
Yeah, the poll surprises me. So the US has one big shot, which is the Moderna, which is ahead, and you've seen some clinical results. But I would say this is a tough one to guess because there are other vaccines that are also in clinic. China has several in clinic. Europe has several in clinic. So the Oxford vaccine, which is now AstraZeneca, that is a very promising technology. They are already in trials. They have several hundred immunized. They have good data in non-human primates, which is very close to humans. There is a BioNTech Pfizer, which is started in Germany, has a US part as well. China has several in phase 2. So this is going to be, I think what you'll see is several cross the finish line around the same time. And another point to remember is who wins the race. There is a different way of thinking about this, which is, okay, you might have a vaccine that works well, but you don't have a scalable technology, right? and somebody else is a month later in their technology, but they can produce billions of doses, right? And so there are other considerations here. Scale is a very big part of this, right? A cheaper, scalable vaccine, billions of doses very quickly, is a superior product than something that comes in early but can only produce 10 million, let's say.
Yeah, we had another question coming in from Singapore, which is that do you think that the world would trust a vaccine coming out of China, given the problems that they've had with vaccine development inside the country over the years?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think China has come quite a ways on quality issues, and they've taken their the incidents that happened very seriously and tried to address them. But China is also looking to trial their vaccines outside of China, and they're working with international partners on their vaccine collaborations. CEPI has a program with China with Clover, a company called Clover. That looks like a very promising candidate. China has registered CEPI is registered in Shanghai. Path, an organization that has a lot of vaccine expertise, is registered in China and is trying to help. So there will be a lot of external validation, as well as what China has done itself to improve vaccine quality over the years.
Okay, let's go to the third polling question. And you know, which of these three statements best describes your thoughts on when corporations should ask employees working remotely to return to their offices? First statement: I'm in a vulnerable category, or I'm afraid of exposure and prefer to work from home. The second statement: I've got dependents, including children, and I can't go back to work until they are taken care of. And then the third category: these are the people who just can't wait to get back to the office. Can I return to work tomorrow? Bring me back as soon as possible. Which of these three statements most describes where you are on this question right now? Let's go to another question from the audience. This one is from Sarah, and again, I apologize if I pronounce this wrong, Lolo, a lecturer at Stenden University in Qatar. Her question is this: after the virus has been contained, what changes do you expect? This question for you, Mike. What changes do you expect will happen with the way we worked before COVID-19? People are avoiding using cash in fear of contracting the virus. Do you believe this pandemic will serve in eliminating the need for cash?
Well, there had already been a secular shift from cash to electronic payments over the last several years. I think this crisis will accelerate that pattern, in part because people are moving on to more and more e-commerce. People who never did e-commerce before, people who might have been older, were not comfortable before with getting online and buying things, are now doing so for the first time. And my guess is that habit will stick even after the crisis is over. And even when it comes to face-to-face, people are looking for ways to be as safe and secure in the way that they transact with each other, and contactless payments, including through cards or a phone, it can be a way of doing that. And so my guess is we will see not necessarily the end of cash, but an acceleration of electronic payments replacing cash more and more. I think beyond that, every company, large and small businesses, are going to be thinking through how do they operate in an online, digital, electronic environment as well as brick and mortar. And they're going to be investing, I think, to make sure that they've got that capability, because whether this virus comes back or another virus comes in the future, this has shown just how vulnerable so many of our businesses are. And there's going to be a real desire to build greater resilience going forward.
Let me ask you a follow-up. At Mastercard, you have incredible access to consumer data right across the globe. In China, which obviously is where the outbreak first occurred, and it's leading the world, out of the crisis. It's probably the first back to work. What we've seen is that while production is up, consumption has remained depressed. Is that the pattern that do you think we'll see that pattern in the US and other countries in the West?
Well, we look at this as really sort of a four-stage process: containment, stabilization, normalization, and growth. And I'd say most economies that we're seeing are in that stabilization phase where things have sort of bottomed out and we're beginning to see increasing consumption in various sectors. There's some sectors that are continuing to be hit hard, obviously things like travel, but on the other hand, groceries and home improvement, home repair are way up, and we're seeing a lot more electronic transactions or e-commerce online transactions than before. So I think we're actually seeing the fall in consumer payments beginning to bottom out and come back a bit. And it may vary from state to state, from country to country, and certainly from sector to sector. But we're beginning to see that movement from stabilization to normalization.
And when will we see the world traveling again? Will we see the world traveling again as it did in the past?
Look, we're hopeful. It may take a while, and it will be interesting to see whether personal travel or business travel comes back first. What sort of new rules apply to travel in terms of seating on airplanes and things of that sort. But we think people have, there's a lot of pent up demand. People want to get out of their house. They want to do it safely, but they want to get out of their house. They want to go back to their normal life. They want to, have a break and go on a vacation and do something different than what they've been doing for the last 8 or 9 weeks. They're looking to find ways to do that safely and securely, but that should also allow for a bounce back in some of these sectors eventually.
Okay, the results of our poll: a third of our delegates can't wait to get back to the office, but more than half, exactly half, in fact, right now, 50% believe that they're in a vulnerable category and would prefer to work from home. 17% have to work at home because they have dependents to look after. Dr. Zaidi, question for you. So far, developing countries have been spared the worst of this pandemic. I mean, is this just a question of luck, or is it climatic factors, or demographic factors? Of course, the median age in Africa is 19, or is it more a question of timing and poor countries about to be hit by the next COVID-19 wave?
So, Andy, that's a great question, and it's a question that is being debated a lot by the modelers and the epidemiologists of the world. And we think that it's probably all of the above, all of the things that you cited. Weather probably less so than we believed in the beginning, because now you can see Brazil being hit very badly. We see northern Nigeria, which is a very hot place, Kano, 40 degrees, 45 degrees centigrade kind of place, which is being, the reports out of there are quite concerning. But age, so population structure, luck, and what you were doing in January and February for chasing travelers who could be coming from China or Iran, which were the two main sort of sources in Africa and Asia in the first part of the year. Whether you had any kind of travel restrictions, how much your population is willing to observe different types of behavior, all are probably playing a role. But hard to say right now, but I would say most people are probably leaning towards that the developing countries are not going to be spared. It's a matter of time. They went into lockdown early when there was not a lot of disease. That lockdown was extremely effective at stopping things. It's no longer possible to maintain the lockdown at the level that it has been maintained. And so easing is happening, even though those countries are still growing in their epidemic. So there is not less than one, but they're having to open up. And so you will see, once it gets into slums and things, that you will see an acceleration. So that's what people believe mostly, but it's a wait and see and hope for the best situation and prepare for the worst in terms of health system capability to cope. And of course, keeping up our effort on vaccines and therapeutics.
Question here from Morishwa Panchal, who is an assistant vice president at JM Financial in India. He asks, how do we ensure that the long-term health implications of a vaccine are not compromised for speed?
No, that's a great question. And we have to be very sure that the vaccine is safe, it holds up. And so the kinds of studies that we are talking about to before a vaccine is launched for mass use is 20, 30,000 sample size for making sure that the vaccine is safe before it's recommended for mass use. That's what people are talking about right now. These are very active live conversations that are happening about what's the size of a clinical trial for phase 3 efficacy. How many people do you need to test the vaccine in to be absolutely sure that it's safe? And how do you build systems that are resilient? So if it's a really, really rare side effect that's not showing up in 20,000, 30,000 type of things, that there is a very appropriate injury compensation mechanism.
A number of people are asking about anti-vaccine movement, anti-vaxxers, a potent force in the United States, also in France, a number of other countries. How worried are you that people in large numbers will actually refuse to take a vaccine if it's developed?
Well, it's one of the big worries that I have, that there's so much misinformation about vaccines that people are not able to judge risk-benefit ratios and make the wrong choice. So it's going to be up to governments, national leadership, global leadership to educate and convince people about the choices that they should be making for protecting themselves. I think that we should stay away from mandatory vaccination because that upsets people. And I think I am hopeful that at least 70% of the people of the world will agree to be immunized, because you're not just protecting yourself, you're protecting others, you're protecting vulnerable populations. So having a selfish attitude about this, you're not just harming yourself, you're also harming others. And so if we can get vaccine to 70, 75% of the world's population, we will be able to protect everybody. But we do need to get to those kinds of levels.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time. We're going to have to leave it there, Mike. And Dr. Zaidi, thank you again for joining us. We're grateful for your participation, for your perspectives. I'd also like to extend our thanks to Dr. Melanie Saville. And thanks to our audience, both within and beyond the Bloomberg New Economy community. Thanks for joining us. We invite you to our next conversation, Emerging Markets on the Brink, focused on the challenge COVID-19 poses to developing economies. That's on Tuesday, June the 3rd. Follow the conversation with @NewEconForum on Twitter or like us on Facebook. And to learn more about other upcoming events, visit our website at neweconomyforum.com. Thank you and stay well.